19. Pretenders. Henry VII's obvious alarm at the advent of successive pretenders to his throne in the course of his reign is evidence enough that he did not know the details of the prince's fate. He had believed them to be dead, but was it just possible that one of them had survived? Had Henry been able to parade the princess through London, as he once did with the Earl of Warwick, after the pretender Lambert Simnel had claimed to be Clarence's heir, then he would have effectively crushed all such pretensions. Instead, the king and his advisers spent considerable time and effort in painstakingly tracing the identity of each of these pretenders, of whom the most prominent were Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. Lambert Simnel's origins are still shrouded in some mystery. Andre says that when the rumors about the princess flared up again, seditious men hatched another novel evil. They maliciously put up a certain boy as the son of Edward IV. This conspiracy was hatched in the summer of 1486 in the vicinity of Oxford, and was certainly the brainchild of John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who lived at nearby Iwelme, not far from Minister Lovell, the seat of the fugitive Lord Lovell, who became a party to the conspiracy. Both men had little cause to love Henry VII. It appears that they had made contact with an Oxford priest of lowly birth, one Richard Simmons, who had in his care a boy of about 11, allegedly called Lambert Simnel. The priest had reared and educated the boy and instructed him in courtly manners. Simmons' loyalties were with the children of Edward IV. Virgil hints that he had purposed to represent the lad as being born of royal stock during Richard III's reign. Now, Simmons conspired with Lincoln and his associates to present Simnel to the English people as the younger of the two princes, Richard, Duke of York. It is probable, however, that Lincoln's true intention was to seize the crown for himself as the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III, once the planned coup met with success. Simnel was duly coached in his role and prepared to impersonate York. Late in 1486, he was sent to Ireland, where many people were sympathetic to the Yorkist cause. For 30 years, members of the House of York had served as lieutenants of Ireland, and their rule had brought benefits to the Irish. At the same time, doubtless prompted by an urgent request from Lincoln, Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV and Richard III, began raising money and troops in the Low Countries in support of the conspiracy. By early 1487, Henry VII had learned what was happening, but by then Simnel was no longer pretending to be York. He now claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, who was, of course, a prisoner in the Tower. Henry and his advisers rightly regarded Simnel, young as he was, as a dangerous threat to the throne and the security of the realm. On the 2nd of February, the council met to discuss the crisis. Amongst other matters, the affairs of Elizabeth Woodville also came under scrutiny, and, says Virgil, it was resolved that she should lose the forfeit all her lands and possessions because she had voluntarily submitted herself and her daughters to the hands of King Richard, whereat there was much wondering. Understandably, since she had committed this misdemeanor 3 years before, and Henry had made no move against her for 18 months. Indeed, up to now, he had behaved towards her with courtesy and respect, and had chosen her as a sponsor for Prince Arthur. Certainly her surrender of her daughters to Richard III had been a major setback to Henry Tudor's cause, and she had had no choice at the time. Henry must have known this, and it is likely that the real reason for Elizabeth Woodville's disgrace was something quite different. What this was has been the subject of considerable conjecture. Bacon says that Elizabeth was at this time extremely discontent with the king, thinking her daughters not advanced but depressed. This attitude may have communicated itself to Henry VII, who, ever suspicious, became convinced that the Queen Dowager was plotting against him, or was even involved in the Simnel conspiracy. As Bacon observed, none could hold the book so well to prompt and instruct this stage play as she could. Yet there is no evidence that Elizabeth Woodville was an accomplice in the Simnel rebellion. She was hardly likely to espouse the cause of the son of Clarence, or take any action that might prejudice her daughter's position or the future of her grandson. On the 20th of February, Parliament declared her estates forfeit, and granted Elizabeth Woodville a pension of 400 marks per annum. Later that spring, warrants were issued to officers of the royal exchequer to pay all issues from the confiscated estates to Elizabeth of York. In this we may perceive the real reason why Henry VII had disparaged his mother-in-law, while she was enjoying the revenues from properties normally used to dower a queen consort. His wife was being deprived of the property appertaining to her estate. Henry had no intention of supporting two queens, and by depriving Elizabeth Woodville of her lands, he rid himself at a stroke of this inconvenience. He had also deprived the Queen Dowager of funds she might use against him. That he had his suspicions about the Woodvilles is confirmed by his imprisonment of Dorset in the Tower until after the rebellion. His later treatment of Elizabeth Woodville is evidence that he had probably believed her have been culpable. Again, his later treatment of Elizabeth Woodville is evidence that he had probably believed her to have been culpable. Having learned that she was deprived of her estates and the income from them, Elizabeth had no choice but to retire to a nunnery. Around the 12th of February, 1487, she moved to Bermondsey Abbey, a 14th century foundation long favored by royal ladies. A beautiful, peaceful place, the abbey had elegant gardens and commanded a sight on the Surrey shore of the Thames opposite the Tower of London. From its windows the aging queen could see across the river to the fortress wherein lay, she believed, the bodies of her sons. At Bermondsey she was assigned apartments once reserved for the use of the Earls of Gloucester, and registered as a boarder. Some revisionists have asserted that Elizabeth was banished to Bermondsey, though there is nothing to suggest that she went there under duress, because she had discovered that Henry had been responsible for the murder of the princess. It is said he wanted to silence her. Bacon alleges that during her retirement it was hazardous for any person to see or speak with her, but the circumstances of her life at Bermondsey from 1487 until her death give these assertions the lie. In no sense was Elizabeth a prisoner. Henry VII continued to refer to her as his right dear mother, and she visited court from time to time. In 1489 she was present when the Queen bore a daughter, Margaret, and afterwards she helped Elizabeth of York host a reception for foreign ambassadors. In 1490 her pension was increased to £400 per annum, and over the years she was given various grants by the Exchequer, such a payment for Christians, sundries, and wines. Elizabeth Woodville died at Bermondsey with her daughters round her on the 8th of June, 1492, and was buried beside Edward IV at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Henry's spies soon discovered the truth about Lambert Simnel's identity, and he was proclaimed an impostor on the 17th of February, 1487. A few days later, Lincoln fled in secret to Margaret of Burgundy in Flanders. On the 29th of February, Henry and Warwick paraded through London to demonstrate the falsity of Simnel's claim. After High Mass at St. Paul's, Warwick was allowed to converse with courtiers who had known him before being returned to the Tower. In March, Henry mobilized his forces in preparation for an invasion. Many people were nevertheless duped by Simnel's supporters into believing in him. Some, of course, found it politically desirable to acknowledge his claims. Lincoln was one of them. By Whitsun, 1487, when Lincoln landed in Ireland with an army provided by his aunt, there was panic in England at the prospect of another dynastic war. The Earl publicly recognized Simnel as his cousin Warwick, and played a prominent part when the boy was crowned Edward VI in Dublin Cathedral on the 24th May. Early in June, the rebel forces, led by Lincoln, crossed to England, but on the 16th of June they were massacred by Henry VII's army at the bloody Battle of Stoke. Lincoln was killed, and Simnel was taken prisoner. Level disappeared. Over 200 years later, a skeleton thought to be his was found sitting at a desk in a walled-up room in Minster Lovel. The king's victory at Stoke was seen by his contemporaries as reaffirmation by the Almighty of the divine judgment made manifest at Bosworth. It left him in a much stronger position, and he could afford to be merciful to the hapless boy who had been at the center of the conspiracy. Simnel was put to work in the royal kitchens and later promoted to be the king's falconer, dying in 1525. Who was Lambert Simnel? Born around 1475, he was described in Lincoln's Attainder as the son of an Oxford joiner and organ maker called Thomas Simnel. Henry VII, in a letter to the Pope, claimed he was illegitimate. However, there is no trace in 15th and 16th century English records of anyone by the name of Simnel, except for Richard Simnel, a canon of St. Osyth's Priory, Essex, in the reign of Henry VIII, who was probably Lambert's son. An account of the Battle of Stoke was written in 1487 to 1489 by one of Henry VII's heralds in the original manuscript. Now, in the British Library, reference is made to the pretender, whose name was indeed John. In a later transcription by the antiquarian John Leland, that name has been changed to Lambert. It seems likely that the boy's real name was not Lambert Simnel, and that name was chosen as a pseudonym, probably to find favor with the people of Flanders, one of whose favorite saints was Saint Lambert, whose reliquary in Liege Cathedral had been a gift from the late Duke of Burgundy, Margaret of York's husband. There is no reason to believe that Simnel had any genetic connection with the royal family, nor that he was any other than common in all respects, as he himself admitted under interrogation. One person who certainly involved in the Simnel conspiracy and suffered for it was Bishop Stillington. He was apprehended and questioned in March 1487, but despite not being charged with any crime, he was kept under house arrest at Windsor Castle until his death in May 1491, to keep him from further mischief. After Stoke, Henry VII set about consolidating his position. He had his queen crowned at last. Her first pregnancy and then the rebellion had obliged him to defer this, much to his subjects' annoyance. In March 1488 he opened negotiations with Spain for the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Prince Arthur, an alliance that would considerably increase the standing of the Tudor dynasty in Europe. But Henry was still by no means secure on his throne at this date. There is evidence that from 1488 onwards, disaffected Yorkists were conspiring against him. In 1489, just as the marriage alliance with Spain was being successfully concluded, Henry began to be troubled by the new wave of rumors, probably originating with these Yorkist malcontents. One of the princes in the Tower still lived. Henry did not know it then, but this was the opening fanfare for yet another pretender. This second, more serious conspiracy probably originated with Margaret of Burgundy. In the autumn of 1491, a young man called Perkin Warbeck appeared in Ireland, calling himself the Earl of Warwick. But almost immediately, on the advice of prominent White House loyalists, he changed his identity to that of Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. The pro-Yorkist Irish soon rallied to support him. News of this new impostor caused Henry VII the greatest concern. This lad, who calls himself Plantagenet, as he referred to Warbeck, with his strong white rose backing, posed a serious threat to the crown, as more and more Yorkist partisans offered him their loyalty. In time, Warwick Warbeck, Warbeck would secure the recognition of most of the princes of Europe, which made him even more of a danger. In March 1492, he was welcomed as a visiting sovereign at the French court and lorded it there for several months. But in November, when England and France signed the Treaty of Etaples, Charles VIII undertook not to grant political asylum to any more pretenders to the English crown. Warbeck fled to Flanders, where Margaret of Burgundy wholeheartedly acknowledged him as her long-lost nephew, and feted him as the rightful king of England. Her stepson-in-law, the Archduke Maximilian, ruler of Low Countries, followed suit. News of these events came, says Bacon, blazing and thundering into England, causing people to take the pretender rather more seriously, and to wonder whether the princess in the Tower had been murdered after all. Many chose to believe that Warbeck was in fact York, and attached themselves to his cause. But by July 1493, Henry VII's spies had uncovered Warbeck's true identity, and the king was able to write a Sir Gilbert Talbot that the pretender was just another feigned lad called Perkin Warbeck, born at Tournai in Picardy, which at his first coming into Ireland called himself the bastard son of King Richard, and after that the son of the Duke of Clarence, now the second son of our father, King Edward IV, whom God assoil. Armed with this knowledge, Henry made a formal protest to the government of Flanders about harboring an impostor to his throne. And when this was ignored, he risked England's commercial prosperity by imposing a ban on trade with the Low Countries. At this time, English supporters of Warbeck were still making the journey to Flanders to offer him their allegiance. Maximilian ignored Henry's Maximilian ignored Henry's remonstrances and took Warbeck into Vienna with him to represent England at his own father's funeral. After his return to Flanders in 1493, Warbeck crossed to Ireland, intending to use it as a springboard for an invasion of England in October 1494. Henry VII sent the redoubtable Sir Edward Poynings to Ireland with instructions to eject the pretender. A month later, the king pointedly created his second son, Henry, aged 3, Duke of York, in a very public ceremony. Meanwhile, Henry's agents had discovered and rounded up Warbeck's chief supporters in England. Most were arrested late in 1494, but the biggest fish of all, Sir William Stanley, brother of the Earl of Derby and brother-in-law to the king's mother, was netted in January 1495 and executed the following month. This deprived the pretender of any cohesive support in England. By March 1495, Maximilian was beginning to grow weary of his guest. who had been forced to return from Ireland to Flanders, and he urged Warbeck to invade England and take what he claimed was his birthright. That summer, Henry VII had his realm placed on invasion alert, and in July Warbeck's pathetic attempt to land at Deal was foiled by soldiers guarding the coast. After returning for a short while to Flanders, Warbeck attempted Ireland once more, but was driven away by Poynings at Waterford in late July 1495. James IV of Scotland now expressed himself sympathetic to Warbeck's cause, glad to have an opportunity of embarrassing Henry VII. In November, the pretender took refuge at the Scottish court, where he was royally received and given one of the king's kinswomen as his wife. Though in February 1496 Maximilian withdrew his support under the term of a treaty, the Magnus Intercursus he had signed with Henry VII, which restored trade between the two countries. By now, Warbeck's credibility had been badly impaired. In 1496, James planned an invasion of England, not to mention on Warbeck's behalf, but to suit his own ends. In the event, the Scots incursion, mounted in September, turned out to be no more than a border raid over in 24 hours. James was disgusted when the squeamish Warbeck expressed outrage over the needless pillaging and destruction of English property, and therefore made it clear to the pretender that his presence in Scotland was not welcome. In June 1497, Henry VII successfully quelled a rebellion by the men of Cornwall against the harsh taxes levied to finance the country's defenses against the Scots. To avoid war, Henry instructed his envoys in Scotland to press for Warbeck's extradition, and a day after they did so he was expelled from Scotland with his wife and sallied to court in Ireland. On the 7th of September, having dodged Poyning's forces, he landed at Cornwall and marched with his supporters on Exeter, gathering an army of yeomen and country folk on the way. Henry VII, learning of his advance, set a great force against him, following behind himself with reinforcements. On the 17th of September, Warbeck laid siege to Exeter, but the city was ably defended by the Earl of Devon, and he was driven off the next day. 3 days later, he moved to Towton, where he learned that the royal army was bearing down on him, and abandoning his rage, force, and their fate, he escaped and galloped south for the coast, but was apprehended on the 5th of October and brought before King Henry. Henry was remarkably lenient with Warbeck. He sent him to London, extracted a confession from him without resorting to torture, and initially placed him in the Tower. After a short time he allowed him to live under guard at court, but not to sleep with his wife, who lived under the Queen's protection. Warbeck was at court for 18 months, but by June 1498 The silken chains that bound him had begun to chafe, and he tried to escape. He was caught within hours, and this time Henry VII was not so forbearing. He had Warbeck placed in close confinement in the Tower, cut off from the light of day. Men who saw him a year later were shocked at how the experience had aged him. Yet still it did not sap his penchant for intrigue. In a cell near him, the Earl of Warwick lived out his dreary existence. It seems almost certain that in August 1499 an agent provocateur was planted amongst the jailers by the government to lure both Warbeck and Warwick into conspiracy, with a view to annihilating two threats to the security of the realm. Why else should Warwick, who had been kept so solitary and close that it was rumored he was dead, he housed in close proximity to the perilous Warbeck and allowed to communicate with him? The government's ploy worked. The two prisoners plotted to escape and overthrow the king. On the 12th of November, 1499, the council were told of this and ordered the arrest of both men. 4 days later, Warbeck was tried and condemned to death. Warwick was arraigned and sentenced on the 19th November. Of him, it was said by Virgil that he could not tell a goose from a capon, and it was believed by many that he had not had the wits to resist being led into the conspiracy, nor had he had any treasonous intent. Warbeck was executed on the 23rd November 1499 at Tyburn, after publicly swearing that he was not the son of Edward IV. His scaffold confession was afterwards printed and widely circulated by order of the king. Warwick was beheaded on Tower Hill a few days later, although most people believed him innocent. His death was deemed necessary, not so much because of his involvement with Warbeck, but because Ferdinand of Aragon was refusing to allow his daughter, Catherine, to come to England while he lived, a potential threat to the crown. The deaths of Warwick and Warbeck certainly removed the worst menaces to Henry VII's security. There were no more impostors after 1499. The fact that Perkin Warbeck managed to maintain his imposture for so long has, over the years, led many writers to assert that he was indeed Richard of York, or at least a scion of the House of York. This, wrote Bacon, was a finer counterfeit stone than Lambert Simnel. He was a youth of fine favour and shape. He had been from his childhood such a wanderer it was hard to hunt out his nest and parents. Bacon felt sure that some hushed-up scandal was attached to Warbeck's birth. He had learned that Edward IV had stood grandfather to the son of a converted Jew, and assumed that his son was really the king's bastard, fostered on a Jewish family. The truth of the matter was that the king had stood godfather to the Jewish Sir Edward Brampton on his conversion to the Christian faith, and Sir Edward was later Warbeck's employer. On the false assumption that Warbeck was Edward IV's bastard, Bacon wrote, "It was ordained that the winding ivy of the Plantagenet should kill the true tree itself. What impressed people about Warbeck were his dignity, his regal bearing, and his knowledge of court matters and of the royal house. His acceptance of a succession of European crowned heads led many to believe that he must indeed be York, or at least a bastard of the house of York. His appearance seemed to confirm this. A drawing of him survives in the French manuscript known as the Recueil d'Arras. And shows a young man with long fair hair, a minor squint or cast in one eye, and features bearing a strong resemblance to those of Edward IV. In 1497, the Venetian ambassador saw Warbeck at Henry VII's court, and described him as a well-favored young man, 23 years old, thus placing his birth date around 1473 to 1474. York was born in August 1473, but the Milanese ambassador thought him not handsome. Indeed, his left eye rather lacks luster, but he is intelligent and well enough to maintain his imposture for several years. When it came to prosecuting his claims, he showed himself inept and cowardly, faults that would bring about his ruin. Warbeck, posing as York, was ever ready to recount the tale of what had happened to him in the Tower. In the autumn of 1493, he described this in a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, in which he declared that he was indeed the son of Edward IV, and that his name was Richard Plantagenet, and that he had been secretly prepared by the murderers of his brother, Edward V. He was careful not to accuse either Richard III or Henry VII of the murder. Once his brother was dead, he said he had been entrusted to a gentleman who had received orders to destroy him, but who, taking pity on his innocence, had preserved his life, and made him swear on the sacrament not to disclose for a certain number of years his birth and lineage. From 1483 to 1491 he lived abroad in a variety of places, and being in the care of two guardians until one died, and the other, Sir Edward Brampton, returned to England, leaving him at a loose end in Portugal. It was at this point that he went to Ireland and was recognized as the long-lost Duke of York. How the Irish recognized York, who had spent his life until the murder in England and was not well known even there, is not satisfactorily explained. The unsubstantiated account received short shrift from the Spanish sovereigns, who did not believe it, as is proved by a note to that effect written on the letter. Nevertheless, other monarchs did recognize Warbeck as York, affirming they had seen birthmarks that satisfied them of his identity. The possibility that Yorkist blood did flow in Warbeck's veins cannot be discounted, although the evidence for it is tenuous. Recognition by other princes was not proof of his identity, since they undoubtedly found it to their advantage politically to arrange his claim, given the fact that all of them, at one time or other, desired to embarrass Henry VII. It is hardly conceivable that Warbeck could have been York. He himself denied it with his dying breath, and his earlier account of his escape from his brother's murderers does not bear close scrutiny, nor is it likely that he was a bastard son of Edward IV, conceived during the king's exile in the Low Countries in 1470 to 1471, and fostered with the Warbeck family as Margaret of Burgundy in 1498 and Warbeck himself in 1497 and 1499, admitted that he was not the son of Edward IV. The future Richard III was also in exile in Flanders in 1490. In 1470 to 1471. He could conceivably have fathered Warbeck, who claimed first of all to be his bastard son. The calendar of state papers in the archives of the Spanish government states that the Archduke Maximilian alleged in later years that Warbeck was actually the bastard son of Margaret of Burgundy by the Bishop of Cambria. In 1492, Margaret had done her utmost to conceive all that she was indeed Richard, son of her brother Edward. She would have been able to do this. Again. In 1492, Margaret had done her utmost to convince all that he was indeed Richard, son of her brother Edward. She would have been able to do this with plausible conviction, in the knowledge that the boy was of Plantagenet blood, and it is true that the people of Flanders and many others believed her. But in 1498, when Margaret learned that Warbeck had sworn that she knew as well as himself that he was not the son of King Edward, the Duchess wrote in secret to Henry VII, and craved his pardon for having supported the pretender, whom she now acknowledged an impostor. Her emissary was the Bishop of Cambrai, who, by a series of diplomatic maneuvers, managed to negotiate a reconciliation. During his visit, he asked to see Warbeck, who was by then a prisoner in the Tower, and was appalled at the change in the young man, who might have been his son. In his confession of 1497, Warbeck himself declared he was the son of John Warbeck, or Osbeck. The Catherine de Faro, his wife, both converted Jews, living in Tournai, where John was a minor official. When Peter, or Peterkin, as he was known, was small, the family had lived for a time in London, where John Warbeck earned a living by supplying carpets to the royal court, by means of which employment he may have gained information that the son would later find useful. In 1484 to 1485, according to his confession, Warbeck was sent to Antwerp to learn Flemish. After war forced him to return home to Tournai for a time, he went back to Antwerp to look after the market stall of a local merchant, but was struck down by illness for 5 months. His career as a salesman then continued under the summer of 1487, when he agreed to escort the wife of Sir Edward Brampton, a prominent Yorkist exile to Portugal. He stayed there a year in the service of a knight before leaving of his own accord to see the world. A few months later he entered the employ of a Breton merchant called Pregent Minot. Minot dealt in luxury fabrics, and Warbeck's job was to model these for customers. This was how he came to be in Ireland in 1488 to 1489. Shortly afterwards, the plot to impersonate Warwick was hatched. By his own admission, Warbeck was not Richard of York. Margaret of Burgundy admitted he was not the son of Edward IV. He could conceivably have been her bastard son or Richard III's, but most probably he was the son of John and Catherine Warbeck of Tournai, a man of straw used by unscrupulous men for their own ends. Significantly, none of the pretenders in Henry VII's time, and Simnel and Warbeck were by no means the only ones, ever claimed to be Edward V. This was not so much because rumor had long proclaimed him to be dead, but because he was too well known both at court and in London to be successfully impersonated. York was not well known at all, and was a far safer target for impostors. After the execution of Warbeck, no one else claimed to be one of the princes. Henry VII's summary justice had ensured that, and even if he had not, the king would soon have been able to deal with such persons speedily and effectively, for in 1502 Henry discovered the truth about the fate of the princess.